Southern monsters. Try to crucify the sun, and you will see who is God. Rozanov. All in all, Isaac decided that there were worse places to be lost and alone in. He had begun to suspect as much sometime during the night of his arrival, when the smear of dark retreated before the powerful floodlights of the Cape Agulhas to reveal his destination. A day later, and he was nearly convinced. The drab chaos of the city had faded from his mind, its web of winding streets alien in concept now that he had experienced the absence of it. Now, after 3 weeks on the island, he was ready to call himself a native. Sure, it was damn cold most of the day, and near freezing at night, and when the wind blew strong enough to push back the cloud bank, it made navigating the treacherous scoria fields as daunting as it was grueling on Isaac's old knees. The food was tepid, he never felt properly dry, and his companions on the island were an obtuse bunch, despite being among the smartest people Isaac had ever spent time with, at least when it came to theory and abstraction anyway. And yet, in his 68 years on God's green earth, Isaac had never felt more at home. He moved slowly across the Klinkerveld, his shotgun bouncing at his shoulder. He walked with a slow, careful purpose, wary of the false promise offered by the rugged black rock. The cool, hardened remnants of millennia-old lava flows that were as slippery as ice. Green and white tufts of moss colonized the soil between the slabs, providing a more reliable foothold for his boots. The going would get more difficult ahead, he knew. On the scoria slopes, where the diurnal rhythms caught the soil between perpetual freeze and thaw, or at the bottom of the ridge, where the ground was frozen solid and covered in needle ice. Isaac unslung his shotgun and cradled it in his arms. He hadn't planned on venturing so deep inland today. By his reckoning, he was already 4 or 5 kilometers away from the station. He'd have to turn back soon, or the night would catch him. His prospects of surviving out in temperatures that routinely dropped below 0 were slim. A movement on the slope caught his eye, just a flicker of charcoal grey in the volcanic rock's penumbra. An irregularity in Marion Island's glacial tempo. He eased down onto his haunches and watched. His eyes quickly sifted through the shapes strewn across the slope, dismissing those that conformed with the natural symmetries he had plotted out in his mind. He was looking for something that did not belong, something as alien to this place as he was. His patience was rewarded a moment later when a small, agile figure emerged from beneath a moss-covered stone bank, not 30 yards ahead. Isaac shifted his weight to his knees and slowly brought the shotgun to bear. He'd seen the cat before. A moth-colored thing, with tattered ears and a face like the flat end of a shovel. A scrapper, Isaac had thought, when he first saw it slinking out of the station bins and disappearing into the cold dark. He'd have put a slug between its rugged ears then and there, but his shotgun had been stowed away in his locker, and the little grey bastard was gone before he could even lower the tin coffee mug from his lips. A scrapper like him. You ought to be thanking me, Isaac thought, as he peered down the barrel. Better this than poison, or the piss-poor traps the research teams had laid. It wasn't the cat's fault they were here, caught on this tiny speck of frozen earth in the Southern Ocean. It wasn't their fault they'd bred, either, driven by the insane impulse to reproduce even here. It was the same instinct that overrode reason in squalor and poverty. Ah, but the cats had gorged themselves. That was their mistake. They had eaten through half the island's bird population in the blink of an eye, and now they had to be removed, annihilated by the very same, no less invasive species that had introduced them to the island in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on Isaac. He nestled the butt of the shotgun in the crook of his shoulder and breathed out slowly. The cat had moved between a pair of welded scoria stones, weathered near as grey as its pelt. He'd wait until he could line its whole body up behind the sights. He didn't want to clip the little beggar. There was no point in letting it suffer. If it were up to him, he'd leave the cats be. God's perfect little killing machines didn't deserve to get slugged just so that some docile, barely sentient burrowing petrels could nest in peace. But it wasn't up to him, and he needed the money. Isaac was staring down the tail end of 60, with only a police pension and a wife who wanted to leave the country before it all fell apart. They'd get something for the house at least, and Marie had some government bonds she'd inherited from her miser of a father. He'd been a stingy old vulture his whole life, only to be found resting upon a mattress full of bonds when he spat out his last spiteful breath. It was almost enough to make up for all the misery he'd caused. Almost. Isaac had decided to wait for the body to grow a little colder before thinking about forgiveness. "Come on," he whispered, urging the cat to move into the open. It rewarded him with a twitch of one of its torn ears, and then it disappeared behind the rocks. Isaac let out a soft sigh and lowered the shotgun. He briefly considered trekking deeper into the veldt to find the creature's lair, but thought better of it after a glance up at the darkening mosaic of Antarctic sky. Here, at the edge of the world, the engine of night was ticking over. The dusk was deep by the time Isaac limped into view of Rockhopper Bay. His left knee started to ache during his descent from the slopes, turning his already slow rhythm into something glacial. He felt old and grey, like a crooked crone of the steppes. He dragged himself across the final half-kilometre despite his legs' throbbing protests. Far better to be bedridden, a leg swollen with gout, than to be caught outdoors at night, when the current rose to 50 and the temperature dropped to nothing. Isaac shrunk into his thick jacket. The wind was a feral thing here, and carried icy shards from the polar vortex. It howled all through the night, like some caged beast, rocking the tin cans the inhabitants called home for 13 months, only to fade into a dull whistle come the morning. He had slept poorly those first few nights on Marion. It was the intermittent moments of silence that were the problem, or rather, the abruptness of their ending. No sooner had he found himself in some peaceful lull, his eyes finally closing, than the wind broke it with all its unchained ferocity. In those brief spaces, caught between sleep and wakefulness, he grappled with insanity. The wind was taunting him, he thought, mocking him with its shrieks. He took a moment to curse the wind, waving his shotgun impotently at the darkening sky, then continued his gradual march to the station. The tin roofs of the huts stuck out like a row of staples against the sombre tones of green and grey, brown rock and soil. The cluster of oblong boxes had been installed on the plateau overlooking Transvaal Cove. It consisted of the research blocks, station office, storage houses, and the facility's living quarters. The buildings were little better than the large shipping containers that found their perennial home in the Cape Harbour, but they were light and easy to transport and assemble, which was prioritized over comfort in the utilitarian calculus of the facility's planners. Each unit stood a foot or so above the ground, held in place by a bristling underbelly of steel poles that made them look like surrealist crabs. Wooden walkways connected the majority of the HAB units, as well as the old chicken coops and bins that sat to the rear of the facility, toward the mainland. Isaac shielded his eyes as the spotlights surrounding the base stirred into life, turning the last struggling shades of sepia light into a brilliant monochrome. His world now reduced to black and white, he stepped onto the walkway and then hobbled toward the habitation blocks and the promise of a warm shower. The research team ate early most nights, while Isaac was still making his way back from the day's hunting, and he usually missed dinner. By the time he limped into the canteen, Only Nick, a senior meteorologist, and one of the engineers remained. They were sitting on a small wooden bench under the cupboards, picking at a plate of slap chips while they debated some or other minor point. The conversations in the canteen usually ranged from science and philosophy to geography and politics, extending as far as children's television shows and comics. It didn't matter. The point was to keep yourself entertained. Isaac greeted the pair with a simple nod and a thumbs up, which they returned before continuing with their conversation. He was little more than the help to them. The realization had wounded his pride at first, but after a week of watching these men work, meteorologists, engineers, geologists, and other experts in various fields, he begrudgingly accepted it. He had never been much of a conversationalist anyway. Besides that, he suspected his presence made many in the team uncomfortable. They were all university-educated academics, liberals and progressives, no doubt. The uniform he'd once donned every morning represented everything they reviled about the current South African regime. As students, they'd probably even marched against him while he watched from the shadow of a Caspia, exchanging cigarettes and small talk with his brothers in tan. 20 years ago, they might have called him a fascist and refused to work while he was on the island in protest. 20 years ago, he might have rapped their knuckles with his baton to remind them who was in charge, that privileged white kids in the suburbs were treated with soft hands, but even that had a limit. Now, he was just an old man with a bad knee, no longer a spectre with a baton, but a shadow with regrets. Isaac switched on the gas stove in the kitchen and retrieved a pot and kettle from the drying rack. He filled the kettle with enough water for 3, then peeled open a can of beef chunks and a bag of frozen vegetables. He threw a handful of noodles into the pot and listened in on Nick and Oppi's conversation.
"I'm still not sure we're on the same page," Oppi was saying.
Isaac had a clear view of the bench from behind the stove and watched the engineer poke the tomato sauce on his plate with a chip and shake his head at Nick.
"I thought the whole point was that the adherents of the two paradigms couldn't communicate with each other."
Not quite. Nick was leaning forward in his seat, his skinny elbows resting on the table. It's that they cannot understand each other using the language of their own paradigm. The two matrices are incommensurable, yes, but once you understand the principles and context of the competing paradigm, there's no reason you wouldn't be able to communicate on their terms, using their matrix. It just takes understanding the internal logic of each scientific paradigm. Nick paused to see if Oppi was following, and then waved a chip at him like a conductor's baton. "Take Lysenkoism," he said, motioning at the air. "You remember the red scientists who thought they could train crops to produce certain characteristics? They treated them with moisture and froze them in a sort of chilling process so that their offspring might better withstand the winter months. Now, if you explained to an avowed Lysenkoist the principles of genetics, most of it wouldn't make any sense. The two paradigms might even share the same vocabulary, heredity, for instance. Lysenkoists thought it was a physiological process extending over the lifespan of an organism as it interacts with its environment. But when a neo-Mendelist uses the term, they're thinking about the distribution of inheritable genes. To them, any changes are the result of past mutations, not environmental interactions. For the two to be able to communicate, they'd have to learn exactly what the other means when he says heredity, and to do that, they'd have to understand a lot more about the opposing paradigm. Does that make sense?"
"Sure," Oppi said slowly, drawing out the word.
He wiped a speck of mustard from his beard and ate another chip.
"So these communities have different explanations for reality, and you are arguing that—"
"Well, that it's not impossible for more than one of these paradigms to be internally consistent, to survive the questions posed by anomalies in their data." Isaac added a pinch of salt to the pot, paused, and then poured in twice as much more. "As salty as the sea," Marie always said, when making pasta at home. He stirred slowly, only half listening. He'd heard this conversation and others like it a dozen times since landing on the island.
"Anomalies are the unexplained problems in a paradigm, yes?" said Oppi.
Nick nodded. The little puzzles that need to be solved in order for the paradigm to remain secure. You can ignore some of them for a while, but if enough of them accumulate, the paradigm collapses.
Like Lysenkoism.
Precisely.
But you think two paradigms can exist simultaneously, and what, both be correct?
Nick laughed earnestly, leaning back on the bench. It's not so much a matter of being correct as it is about being internally consistent. If both can explain the natural world in a way that is neither dogmatic nor bogged down by unexplained data, then I don't see why not.
Yes, but one of them has to be wrong, doesn't it?
Nick shrugged. In math, there is more than one way to get to any given answer. 2 plus 2 equals 4, 3 plus 1 equals 4, 5 minus 1 equals 4.
Yeah, but within the same paradigm, said Oppi. You're suggesting that a competing paradigm might get to 4 without mathematics.
Something like that, said Nick. Isaac removed the kettle from the stove and filled a mug for himself and 2 others. Or perhaps it would give us a different answer altogether, Nick commented.
Oppi snorted. Not 4?
Maybe. Oppi was quiet for a little while, and then said,
This hypothetical paradigm, Nick, what problem do you think it might solve that we haven't?
Nick paused, and then said, The angels.
Angels? Asked Isaac, arriving at the bench with the mugs of tea. To his knowledge, most of the island's core of scientists were secular. He'd assumed Nick was too.
Nature's little gifts, said Nick, looking up. He smiled at the sight of the tea and nodded gratefully, accepting the mug and warming his hands with it. He was one of the few at the research station who treated Isaac with, if not respect, then cordially enough anyway. It was his father who had helped Isaac get the work. He'd been a civil rights lawyer when Isaac was just starting out as a junior officer in the force. After a few years, he'd moved on to start his own firm, but somehow their relationship had survived. Anyone who's worked in the courts knows that there is a particular sort of currency between lawyers and police. It's not corruption, not quite, but a certain type of favor, an early look at a police docket, a moment alone with a suspect, that sort of thing. Isaac and Mr. Coetzee had never been friends, but over the years had come to know each other well and exchanged many favors. Still, it had come as a surprise when Anton invited him for a wimpy coffee and told him about his son's work. He must have known Isaac was struggling, though he didn't owe him anything. It had been a lifeline.
Anomalies in our data,
said Oppi, taking his own mug. His gaze remained fixed on Nick. That's right, said Nick, matching Oppi's stare. He took a sip from his mug and smiled appreciatively. Good hunting? He asked from behind the lip of his mug. Some, said Isaac. He'd been a cop long enough to know when he was being guided away from a topic, but he didn't begrudge Nick that. These two had better things to do than teach an old man about their work.
Spotted that little grey bastard in the scoria fields again. Sootpoot still at large, is he?
Oppi showed his teeth from behind his beard in an ugly smile.
When you finally slug him, put a second one in him for me, okay? He's killed more birds on this island than all the others combined. A one-cat genocide, that one.
Isaac frowned, remembering the agile figure between the rocks.
I'll try, but he's a crafty little devil.
I wouldn't worry about him too much, said Nick. He placed his mug on the table and stretched his arms languidly. After a yawn, he said, Sootpoot's been around since my first trip, when I was still a student. That was 10 years ago. The team I arrived with tried to poison him. Others went after him with bats and shovels. And now, you're here with a shotgun. He's not as young as he used to be, little Blackfoot. Wiser, I'll bet, but old. If you and your slugs don't get him, his years soon will.
Him and I both,
said Isaac, feeling his years on his knee. Nick smiled mirthlessly, and then got up from the bench and bid them both good night. Oppi soon followed, leaving Isaac to his noodles and the dirty mugs. Isaac shared a small, cramped room with the station's radio technician, Neil. It was homely enough, with carpeted floors and insulated walls decorated with dozens of framed and unframed photographs, the left-behinds from previous teams stationed on the island. 2 portholes looked out over Transvaal Cove, affording them a view of the pebbled beach and the icy black plain of water that stretched out into the horizon. During the day, Isaac could watch the swell rise and fall over the stony beach from his bunk. At night, looking out through the porthole was like staring into an inkwell. Neil was already fast asleep by the time Isaac limped into the room. He changed quietly, replacing his thick layers and jacket with his more comfortable, but no less thick, sleeping wear, all to the score of Neil's throaty snores. He glanced at his watch. 22:53. Marie would still be awake, combing over Davy's letters, or penning one of her own in the kitchen by the warm stove. Maybe Yappy would be curled up by her feet. If she were writing anything, it would be to the boy. Isaac still wrote to her sometimes, but didn't expect anything in reply. Not since Davy left. Against Isaac's wishes, Davy had dropped out of university to pursue his art. He just needed time, he'd told Marie and Isaac when he shared the news. He'd go back in a semester or 2, and everything would be okay, tu weet? Instead, not a month after submitting his withdrawal notice, he'd found himself with a reply from the state. It came in the form of a conscription letter and a pair of Wehrmacht boots. Marie had been inconsolable. Then she became cold, near fanatical. She made it her singular mission to keep Davy out of the war. She wrote to the minister, phoned in favours from her years as a matron, hunted down old contacts from school. When none of that worked, she started plotting Davy's escape. She would go with him, of course, to England or Australia or wherever would take them. Isaac would stay behind to look after Yappy until he could sell the house. Then he would join them, or not. Marie had made it clear that Isaac hadn't done enough to keep Davy from the SADF, that he could do what he wanted when she left. They'd fought, row after row, in the house, in the garden, in the kitchen she wrote her letters from. Yappy earned his name between their feet as they had at it.
This is the fucking army, Marie. You think they care about an old cop? You think I have any say in this? Damn it, use your head, woman.
And it was true. There was little he could have done. He was a civilian with as much sway in the SADF as his wife or son. But he'd barely tried. And both Marie and Davy had known it. That was what counted. That was his betrayal. Somewhere deep inside, Isaac had hoped the army might be redeeming. He thought it might knock the Marxist nonsense out of Davy's head and help bridge the gap between them. Perhaps, when Davy returned, their relationship would be better for him having gone. It was only later that he realized his mistake. That this was just another incident in a long line of inaction. He had hoped the army could make his boy more like him, that his silent objection to the Nats meant anything at all, that the world could be fixed passively. It was one of his core failings, he knew. The belief that something could be fixed without him. He'd always been an observer, even to the car crash that was his own life. Eventually the boy's mother had seen reason. Davy couldn't escape his duty, couldn't be marked with something like that so young. But now he was half a continent away, and who knows what sort of man might return to them. Isaac said a quiet prayer for Davy and Marie, even for little Yappy, then clambered up the wooden rungs to his bed. It was a rare night on Marion when Isaac's sleep went undisturbed by dreams, and tonight was no exception. He suspected it had something to do with the amount of walking he was doing, kilometre after kilometre every day after years of sedentary living, or it might be the fresh air, or both. When the dream came, it was a familiar one, both the dream and the events unfolding within it. Isaac was in uniform, huddled up beside a yellow police van. A cold northwester was blowing, howling through the shacks and small lean-tos of the township. Other men stood with him, braced against the wind in their blue uniforms, waiting for the operators to emerge from the narrow roads between dwellings. A Caspia rumbled up behind them to join the growing line of police vans. Its presence was a comfort, strength in the face of this warren of resentment. Isaac saw shadows moving along the roads, watching them from afar. He couldn't make out their faces, but he could still see the whites of their eyes. The same was true of his colleagues in blue. Their faces were obscure, hazy blurs of static like a conked-out TV, but their eyes were clear, affixed to the haze like floating marbles. Somewhere nearby, a dog started to bark. It was an angry sound, harsh and echoing, the grate of an animal caught in a confined space. A radio squawked from one of the vans nearby. "Bystand on to Ontfang." Isaac tensed, turning out to see a clot of shadow with 6 legs spring from the settlement. It ran at a jagged clip, its legs unsynchronized and sprawling. The shadow became 1, then 2, then 3 distinct forms. 2 white men in plain clothes that still managed to look like soldiers, and a third, a young black man, his hands bound, his feet dragging. Isaac could see his face. The operators half carried, half dragged their detainee toward the police line. They threw him to the ground in front of Isaac and motioned at him to open the back of the van.
"This one's been stirring cuck a long time."
The operator's eyes were cold and hard, like those of a caged lion. His shimmering face flared with static, as if charged by an electric current. The other operator squatted down beside the detainee. He held a Walther PP casually in the one hand. Gesturing with it at the detainee, he said, "You want to play soldier, hey? MK? You want to fight? You'll get your chance, don't worry, my boy. Don't worry, we'll get you sorted." The young man didn't flinch, didn't twitch. He stared ahead into nothingness, his jaw fixed hard. He was a lion himself.
"Claim up," said the operator with leonine eyes. "This one's for Flakblas."
Isaac awoke with a shiver and found the world around him caught in one of those moments between the howling winds. Even Neil's sonorous snores had deadened in deference to the peace. The respite wouldn't last, Isaac knew. Before long, the hab block would rattle as nature pounded on its thin steel casing, while Neil's throaty snores beat at the walls from within. He turned on his side, hoping to fall back to sleep before the threnody began, when he felt it. There was something in the room with them. He knew it as surely as he knew that Neil still lay sleeping in the bunk below his. He stared into the dark, searching for an outline, a movement within the cramped space. Isaac's eyes, so well used to finding alien things, came to rest on a shape in the corner of the room. His heart raced. Something was there. Something dead in the room with them. It moved, and Isaac found himself frozen in fear. The dead thing shifted slowly, opening its arms, those splintered limbs like wings. Isaac saw a face in the eddying dark, a gaunt visage with static for eyes and no mouth. The carrion angel unfolded, growing wider, spilling into the empty spaces of the room. He saw its hands, fingers unfurling into short, stubby digits. Inchoate, rudimentary, like some half-formed ab thing. They reached toward him. Isaac couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He felt a moan escape his lips. Then he felt something against his legs, moving up his body like the tendrils of some Stygian worm, cold as though freshly thawed. A sound burst from the dead thing, from the sealed hole of its mouth. A siren, a blast of white noise. the attenuated notes of a distorted radio. Isaac opened his mouth to scream and jolted awake. He was sitting in his bunk, his underclothes and blankets sweated through. He flinched from the dark, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, but for him and his roommate's reassuring snores. Isaac sucked in a deep breath and glanced out the portholes. Still caught halfway between his dreamscape and the real, for a brief moment in time, the windows were tunnels. Not metaphorical windows, but tunnels into another world. He saw an etiolated landscape, an impossible skyline, swirling shapes and patterns that made his eyes hurt. The vision flickered, and then was shattered by a sound coming from behind the hab units, like tin cans banging. The bins. Sootput. Isaac stumbled from his room into the sparsely lit passageway between rooms, still dragging on another layer for outdoors. He yanked his locker open and retrieved his shotgun and a handful of rounds, pausing only to listen to the sounds of bins being turned over. Then he made for the door. By the growing sounds of hissing and rowing, it seemed Sootput had company, competition for the leftovers to be looted from the bins. Isaac paused midway down the passage to listen. He heard scampering paws, little bodies hurling themselves after one another, then a hollow sound as one of them got onto the roof. More hissing. Isaac cracked the shotgun open and loaded 2 slugs, limp marching the last steps to the door. The spotlights were on outside, illuminating the rickety path between the hab units and the rest of the research base. The bins lay just out of view, adjacent to Isaac's section of the dorms. He took a slow breath, calmed his nerves, and stepped out into the cold. At least 3 of the bins had been knocked over, their contents spilled across the small, hard-earthed quad behind the hab unit. A red rubbish bag gaped, showing its rotting insides, torn open by hungry paws. The stink of rubbish filled Isaac's nose with his first breath. He glanced about the yard, looking for flickering shadows or the fleet movement of the little grey savage and his accomplice. The bag gasped as the wind returned, ruffling its plastic creases and forcing Isaac to hunch against it. When he looked up, he thought he saw something shifting away from the bag, moving behind the bin. He lifted the shotgun to his shoulder and waited. "You won't be needing that," came a voice near his ear. Isaac swore and nearly yanked the trigger. Slowly he turned his head toward the voice. Tobias, the senior station officer, was standing in front of the hab door, his gloved hands raised in a gesture of peace. Isaac frowned. The voice had sounded closer, almost in his ear. He lowered the gun. "No one ever told you not to sneak up on someone while they're hunting?" Tobias smiled and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Isaac, I've not had the fortune of that lesson. Though perhaps if we kept the hunting away from the station, it might not be necessary." The station officer wore his beard long, like everyone else on the island. He was tall, taller than Isaac, than most men, with the sort of hunched stoop that came with being self-conscious of that fact. He was thin, even under all his layers, and Isaac knew that the man's arms were like 2 pale toothpicks beneath. But it was his eyes that really set him apart. They were icy blue, like chipped shards of tundra, as startling in contrast as the permafrost on Marion's rugged volcanic slopes. Isaac grunted and finally lowered the shotgun. "Point taken." "Let's get out of this wind," said Tobias, still smiling. He opened the door and beckoned toward Isaac. For the second time in 24 hours, Isaac felt like he was being guided away from something, like he was being corralled like some farm animal. He hesitated, then turned back to face the yard. A shadow was moving between the fallen bins, and Isaac was sorely tempted to send a shot after it, despite Tobias's gentle reprimand not a minute before. But the shadow, when it emerged, wasn't feline at all. It was Nick. He saw Isaac and made to turn around with something like panic writ upon his face. Tobias waved at him. "That's all right, Nick," he called. "I think it's okay. Come on through." Isaac frowned. Nick wasn't alone. He was carrying something in his arms. Sutput, he thought, bemused, and then angry. These bloody scientists and their cats. But no, it wasn't Sutput at all. It wasn't even a cat. Isaac stared. The creature Nick held within his protective cradle was vaguely cat-sized, that much was true, but any of the regular comparisons Isaac might make were wiped from his mind at the sight of the thing. He counted pale yellow folds, like the frills of a mushroom, covering an oblong shape of faintly translucent skin. It shimmered beneath the light of the yard. Tendrils hung from its body. Some were coiled around Nick's arms, as if to return his embrace. Others dangled almost to the floor. They seemed to shiver in the wind, moving in 1,000 infinitesimal motions, like feelers, like limpets on a coral reef. Isaac thought of a jellyfish, and then of photos he'd seen of the ugly deep-water fish he'd been shown. The blobfish, he thought it was. But neither of those were adequate, and besides that, he couldn't see the thing's face, just the curves of the spherical bulb and protruding frills. Isaac stuttered something incomprehensible, and then closed his mouth, unable to articulate the question. The questions. "Aku's been hunting too," said Tobias. He placed a hand on Isaac's shoulder and nodded toward the hab door. "Let's get you inside, then we can talk." This time, Isaac let himself be guided. "Have a seat," said Tobias when they reached the canteen. "Nick, some coffee, please, with a splash of something stronger for Isaac, I think. I'll take Aku." Isaac watched as the creature changed hands, slipping like jelly into Tobias's waiting arms. "Aku?" he finally asked, finding something to say as he stared. The creature vibrated at the sound of its name, its folds of waxy, translucent skin shimmering with the movement. A pair of opalescent circles looked back at Isaac. Eyes, he wondered. "Ah, yes," Tobias replied, exchanging a wink with Nick. "It's something of a joke between us on the island. Aku, it's a morpheme, a part of her full name, lacuna. Aku, lacuna, comes from the gap, is the gap, both in our scientific and linguistic knowledge." "I don't know how she got out." Nick flicked on the stove, rummaging through drawers before retrieving a tin of coffee from the lower shelf. "She doesn't like her box, and I don't blame her. Not when the wind is like this." "Not when Sutput is around," Tobias added, giving the creature what Isaac interpreted as an affectionate squeeze. "Isaac's not the only one after that little fiend, is he?" "That too." Nick pursed his lips in an expression Isaac recognized from his father. "I'm sorry, Tobias, and you too, Isaac. You weren't supposed to see her." "But now you have," said Tobias. He appeared unbothered by the events. Still balancing Aku carefully in the pit of his arm, he removed the glove from his hand. Then he placed his open palm on the center of the creature's body. Slowly, delicately, he began to stroke Aku. Isaac looked the length and breadth of the gelatinous shape and blinked. "How do you know it's a she?" "Simple," said Tobias, not looking up. "She told us." I'm still dreaming, Isaac thought. That or I'm losing my marbles, like Marie always said. In the fluorescent light of the canteen, Isaac was able to observe the creature, this Aku, clearly for the first time. Its skin had taken on a faintly bluish tinge, reaffirming the idea of a jellyfish in his mind. But beneath that, streaks of grey and silver whisked like clouds on the wind, like smoke or ephemeral vapour. Tobias held a constellation in his arms, a fleshy, gooey, abstract constellation. It chirped, and Isaac knew that it was content without understanding the sound itself. "What?" he burbled, shaking his head, baffled, nearly dazed. "Take it easy," said Nick, placing a mug in front of him. A half-jack of whiskey appeared in his other hand, and he poured from it liberally. Isaac took the mug without stirring, taking most of the whiskey in his first sip. Nick topped him up, then took the seat opposite Isaac on the bench, beside Tobias. "We think it came out of the ice during the last thaw," said Tobias, preempting at least one of his questions. "Or washed up after the Vela incident," said Nick. "Oppie swears he saw it, but I'm not so sure. The testing might have opened something up on the ocean floor. Who knows?" Isaac gave him a blank look. "The double flash event," Nick explained slowly. "The Nats and Yehudi set off a pair of nukes here in 79, though they'll never admit it. The Americans saw the whole thing, though they'll probably never admit it either." Isaac felt the whiskey doing its job, warming his stomach. He glanced at Aku, and then back at the scientists. "Is it an alien?" The question felt stupid, almost childlike on his lips, but he had to ask. "Yes," said Nick bluntly. "We think so." Tobias nodded his agreement, though Isaac thought he detected not a little humour in his eyes. "Just now, how come I could—" Isaac faltered, looking from Tobias to the creature. "Understand?" Tobias asked, smiling patiently. Isaac nodded. "Figure that out and you'll be first in line for a Nobel Prize." Tobias let Aku's veiny tendrils wrap around his fingers, intertwining as he stroked the gently oscillating orb. Aku wanted water. Isaac gasped, his hair standing on end. "I'll get it," said Nick, getting up from the bench. He filled a glass from the sink and returned to his seat, placing the glass in front of Aku. Aku was thankful. 3 of her octopoidal limbs uncoiled from around Tobias's arm. They rose like snakeheads, quivering gently before submerging in the water. "I don't understand," said Isaac numbly. "But you do." Nick gave him a humorless smile, again an expression mimicking his father's. "That's the problem." "The problem," Tobias said, "is one of translatability. Aku communicates in a language none of us understand, and yet meaning is perfectly conveyed. There are no discernible words, no signifiers, no pattern or recognizable cadence, but there is meaning. We've tried repeating the sounds back to her and to each other, but it's gibberish. Sometimes she'll make the same sound, one we've recorded and studied, and it'll mean something entirely different, throwing everything we think we've learned into disuse." Tobias's blue eyes seemed to glow, taking on an almost ethereal tinge, but the frustration in his voice was clear. "Does Aku communicate in a million synonyms, or is her language entirely context-dependent? If there's a pattern to it, it's one I can't identify. I've tested for phonemic structure, done frequency tabulations, gone through 1,000 syntactic forms, and tested all of them. Nothing. When she speaks, it's in a language without a vocabulary, or her way of understanding is so different from our own that we'll never be able to translate it directly." Isaac thought back to the conversation he'd heard between Nick and Oppie that evening. "Like another paradigm," he said, testing the word. A rare look of surprise passed over Tobias's face, and he gave Nick a sidelong glance. "That's right, Isaac. A linguistic anomaly by all accounts." Aku was tired. Isaac stared at the creature. He was still in shock, but no longer reeling from the revelation of Aku, and was better able to grasp the feeling of her expression/communication, this alt-speak. Equaled, Aku was tired, but a moment before, the very same sound had denoted thirst. "I'll take her," said Nick. He reached for Aku, who chirped again, "Goodbye, good night, bliss, sweet, somnus," and coiled her tendrils around Nick's waiting arms. He lifted her like a baby, and then bid them both good night before trudging out of the canteen, Aku's twirling tendrils wrapped around his shoulders and neck. Isaac fidgeted with his mug's handle and noticed the bottle Nick had left behind. He sipped the dregs of coffee and considered adding another splash of whiskey.
"Is it telepathy?"
he asked, after the silence had settled and it became apparent Tobias was happy to keep it that way. "I've considered it. No." Isaac nodded, pouring from the half-jack. He'd heard stories from ex-army boys who'd joined the force after their tour of duty. They'd worked with plain-clothed intelligence officers, U.S. consultants they called them, in the border war. The consultants had loose lips, apparently, or they might have been talking cuck or bragging to new friends. They'd told Isaac's colleagues of the U.S. Army's interest in telepathy and other psychic phenomena that was being studied intensely on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It was going to be the next thing in warfare, Isaac had been assured. He wondered what they'd make of this. Tobias watched him finish his drink. "Sometimes she says things we don't understand," he said, when all there was the rattle of the wind between them. "It's just consciousness. Nick calls it the numinous cant, Aku's spheric jargon, but I've told him to stop with that, or he'll get ideas about her."
"What do you mean?"
"Nature's angels," Tobias said.
"I thought those were anomalies."
"Aren't they?" Tobias sighed, his cold blue eyes showing his fatigue.
"I'd rather we didn't begin attributing Aku's existence to something outside of material constraints, to the numinous.
Some of the team get a little bit strange about her as it is already. Understandably, but still. The others, from my understanding, have elicited the same response." Isaac raised a brow.
"Others?"
"Forget I said that," Tobias smiled. "Forget about everything, would you, Isaac? We aren't quite ready for the world here on Marion."
"Who would believe me?"
Isaac rubbed his leg under the table, feeling a sharp ache in his calf. He hoped it wasn't another clot. He took a sip from his mug, now only whiskey, then poured another half mug. To thin the blood, he justified to himself.
"You said that sometimes you can't understand Aku."
Tobias nodded once in that way of his. He leaned back on the bench and traced the skin of his arm where Aku's tendrils had been with a finger. "I suppose that's only half true," he said, folding his long arms and looking up. It was like watching a spider move, Isaac thought. A pale, blue-eyed ice spider. It's more that, on occasion, Aku might communicate a meaning that none of us is familiar with. Isaac must have made a strange face at that, because Tobias took a moment to consider his next words before continuing. "When we talk about a feeling or experience, there is both a word and a corresponding concept the word refers to. If I get caught in a storm, I might describe a feeling of wetness, of being wet. And if not in those words, then I might deconstruct the concept and describe it using any number of other words. But the meaning, the feeling of wet, is communicated. Okay?"
"Yeah, sure,"
said Isaac, feeling the whiskey, feeling out of his depth. "Well," said Tobias, "what I'm getting at is that Aku is able to communicate experiences that do not fit into our language, neither as a single constrained word or as a wider concept that we can deconstruct and approximate. Think about that, Isaac. A feeling for which a word, for which a concept simply does not exist. Something truly indefinable, totally outside of categorization. It'd be as if the word wet didn't exist, nor the concept behind it. A whole feeling outside of our understanding. And what about concepts, numbers, negative, paradigm, myriad? How many other ideas exist beyond our frame that we cannot even begin to conceptualize within our linguistic matrix? Tobias took a breath, exhilarated, his eyes alight with something that looked a little bit like fervor. Isaac blinked. He recognized the look on the scientist's face. He'd seen it on Davi's too. Enthralled, enwrapped, caught by something almost religious.
"Ik verstaan,"
said Isaac. He finished his drink. The next day, Isaac set off early, before the rest of the research team had stirred. Neil murmured something haggard at him from within his mound of pillows and blankets, and Isaac grunted something back. It might have been, "Good luck, thanks." It might have been a meaningless slur of words. Regardless, the intention, the meaning behind the words, was shared and understood. Isaac's left knee was sore, nearly buggered, he thought. On any other day he would have stayed indoors, or at least within shouting distance of the station. But after the night's events he needed to walk. He needed to clear his head. And he needed to get away from the station, if only for a few hours. The sky was silver-grey when he set out, threaded by clouds shattered by the storm. Mercifully, the wind had breathed her last during the night, and gifted Isaac with a rare morning of calm. He headed south along Tripod Beach, then cut inland between the Albatross Lakes. He walked toward the horizon, that line of constant grey that enveloped the southern hemisphere, broken only by the wash of sun that promised warmth, but gave only tepid comfort. Around midday, Isaac navigated the rocky banks of Stony Ridge before descending upon Sealer's Cave. He shrugged off his shotgun and slowly skirted the rocky escarpment above the cave mouth. Mice inhabited the network of lava tunnels beneath the cave, making it a bountiful hunting ground for the island's cats, and now Isaac. From the slopes, he could see all the way across the mouth of Soft Plume River to the hook of Kilowave Cove. The ocean spread across the horizon to his right, encompassing all from east to south. It was choppy and black, frothed up by the winds of a circumpolar current that was leaving the island be, for now. All around him, evidence of the erratic climate and its produce was strewn. Patterned gravel beds capped by snow and ice, shattered grey lava rocks, broken up by the constant cycle of freeze-thaw, striated boulders that sublimated into the soil, and then the black hole below, a chasm into the earth, into Marion's heart. An alien place, Isaac thought, as he navigated the steep incline, his eyes flicking back and forth from the sea. From here he would have been able to watch the HMS Terror and Erebus pass by before their fateful journey north. The story went that Captain Ross took one hard look at the island and decided that his crew deserved better than the cold, treeless expanse it offered. Thou treeless, verdureless, desolate isle of the ocean. The fate that awaited him and his crew was worse. A frozen hell, madness, cannibalism perhaps, and then death. Isaac paused to catch his breath, balancing on the slope like a mountain goat, his one hand held out toward the sea for balance. The cave mouth stared up at him, empty and dark. Sailors once took shelter from the wind and rain within its depths, as he did now. Those men would have been left here for weeks, even months. To hunt, to scurry between the rocks and crags like sea mice, only finding safety in the depths of a hole, fending off deprivation and hunger and boredom, but mostly just the cold. Isaac thought of another pit, another cage for humanity. C-16, Flukplas. He dreamed of the boy often now, more so than in the days following the raid anyway. Was it guilt? Perhaps his burden was growing heavier as his final years raced toward him. Perhaps once he was done hunting cats, he would seek forgiveness for his part in it. But from whom? The boy? They would have tried to bribe him, offered him money or safety or power. He might have become one of their askaris, working for the white cops, informing on his brothers and sisters. Apartheid turned men into dogs and then made them beg for scraps. Isaac knew this, had always known this. And yet, what could he have done? Stepped forward, protested with the Liberals, been flung in jail, his job taken? Yes. If the bribes failed, they would have broken him, beaten him near death, tortured him in their hidden rooms. Or did the operators of C-16 work in the open, unafraid? That might be worse. Still, he had done nothing. Isaac knew his burden was cowardice of a particular shade. He lacked conviction, moral courage, something the boy from the slums had in buckets, even as he was dragged from his bed by vengeful operators and flung into the back of a yellow bakkie. There had been something in his eyes that made Isaac think he wouldn't have succumbed, wouldn't have given in to the bribery or beatings. It was defiance, pride, rage. He wouldn't have been broken. He would have died at Vlakplaas. By the time Isaac completed his descent from the crags, the wind had started up again. It whipped in from the sea, slapping his face with an icy wrist, forcing him to move up close to the slope before the cave's entrance. He stared into the murky dark, listening to the sounds stirring from the world within, dripping water, the moan of the wind, the echo of the sea, and just faintly, the scurrying of little feet. Isaac switched on his headlamp and went in. Evidence of the scientists' attempts to rid the island of both the cats and the mice was everywhere. Isaac counted 6 rusted steel anchor traps before he stopped counting. Some of them were sealed shut, the gnawed clean bones of their victims laying like pearly white stones in this mausoleum. The dead were mostly mice, but Isaac saw 1 or 2 larger carcasses he couldn't identify. Rats, perhaps, but never cats. They were too smart for the traps, for the scientists with their PhDs and theories. Tobias and his predecessors didn't have the stomachs for killing. Sure, they laid their traps and poison, but then they left them, unwilling to see the fruits of their labor. When Isaac had returned to camp the night of his first hunt, he'd carried a brace of dead cats, all dangling from a hook on his belt. Pete, a junior geologist, had greeted him in the yard, but turned pale the moment he saw what Isaac had brought back with him. He couldn't leave the bodies behind. He'd been warned explicitly not to. It had messed with the island's delicate ecosystem. 1,200 dead cats just left to rot, day in, day out, would cause as big a problem as the one he'd set out to solve. Now he had to sneak about at night, cremating the dead when nobody was around, as if it might sterilize the act. As if it might absolve the scientists, the genesis of the Marian cat problem of guilt. Isaac trudged down the throat of the cave with a slow, ponderous stride, scanning left and right as he moved deeper into the island's core, his torch swinging like a lighthouse beam. Not a few meters in, he came upon the ruins of an old ladder. Wood from before they figured out it wouldn't last in this place. Rotten from years of moisture, gnawed upon by hooked teeth. It lay half submerged in a pool of seawater. Behind it, the newer steel ladder rose from the wall to disappear into the inky murk above. Isaac knew there was a ledge there, a rock shelf that extended and converged with a network of 3 more tunnels. Graffiti and rock art and bones full of scrimshaw filled those passages, left behind by the sailors who had carved out the walls. Perhaps on another day Isaac might have clambered up the ladder and continued the hunt in the passages above, but his knee hurt, and he didn't feel like hunching over in those tight spaces. In truth, all he wanted was to sit and think, and perhaps have another sip of whiskey. He dug around the folds of his overcoat and retrieved the bottle Nick had left on the table. Then he leaned his back against the wall and twisted off the cap. A shadow darted past his feet. "Fuck!" he barked, swinging the shotgun with his one free hand and bringing his other to bear on the trigger. The bottle slipped from his fingers, smashing on the rocks. Amber gold liquid spread across the floor, seeping in between the stones. Isaac swore again and looked deeper into the tunnel, illuminating the slick, wet walls with his torch. The stone was dark and textured, like cancerous welts, the lungs of Marion concealing her heart. With his eyes, Isaac tracked the path the shadowy interloper might have followed past his feet. A mouse? No, too large for that. A cat, then. There was a splash to his left, a sudden hiss, followed by a moment of anachronism. Isaac turned. Yellow eyes, a shadow and shape, wet, dripping. An explosion from the hand, a shot, missed. Tooth and claw. Isaac dropped his shotgun and grabbed at the cat, now making a bloody mess out of his left arm, kneading and clawing. He yanked it by the scruff of its neck and pulled it away from his arm to hold, thrashing in the air before him. A grey, flat face stared back at him. It hissed and clawed at him. Sootput. "You little bastard!" Isaac searched for his knife with his free hand, struggling to keep the cat at arm's length. Sootput was heavy, pure muscle, and hissing anger. Feral, unconstrained violence. Isaac's arm dropped under the weight, and with a triumphant "Row!" Sootput swiped up at his fingers. He yipped and let go, stumbling backward as he tried to regain his balance. Sootput hissed again, and then disappeared into the dark, sliding into one of 1,000 holes. Isaac stared down at his ruined sleeve and saw pale skin beneath. Blood dripped from a handful of light surface wounds, and one deeper gash. He'd have to get stitches and a shot. Who knew what diseases Sootput harbored? That ended the hunt too, he thought, as he picked up his shotgun and limped for the cave mouth. He paused by the entrance, struck by another thought. With the exception of Sootput, he hadn't seen a single other cat on the island all day. "That's not looking so good." Sinclair, the station's medical officer, frowned down at Isaac from the top step of the med lab. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up. I'll have a look at that arm." "Before it falls off," Isaac said, "and mucks with your precious island's ecology." Sinclair humoured him good-naturedly, which meant he ignored his grumpy patient's mood and treated him with the detached, tried-and-tested bedside manner of every GP just trying to get through the patient list. "Sootput, you said?" Sinclair guided him toward the nearest of the 3 examination beds that made up the unit. "In the Sealer's Cave. That's a little way away from his usual spot, isn't it?" "He goes wherever he bloody wants," said Isaac, "like the devil. He's using the tunnels to pop out from his holes all across the island, grab what he wants, then sneak back into his hellish lair." "The devil," said Sinclair, still smiling. "Well, even the devil must eat. I'm sure you'll catch him soon, Isaac. Now, let's see what Flatface did to your arm." Isaac ground his teeth as Sinclair cut and pulled at his tattered sleeve. Blood had dried into the jacket, making it stick like glue to Isaac's skin. Eventually, Sinclair snipped the sleeve off at the elbow and slowly pulled the rest off his arm.
Jesus,
said Isaac, wincing. 3 small puncture marks orbited a larger tear running across his forearm. Sootpoort's fangs had caught in the skin. When Isaac had tried pulling him off, they dragged long furrows down his arm, ending just below Isaac's wrist. "You're lucky he didn't hit a vein," said Sinclair, grabbing gauze and sterile swabs from the trolley. Isaac winced again and looked away as Sinclair cleaned the wound, feeling the burn like a second bite. When he looked back, Sinclair was staring thoughtfully at the larger of the wounds.
"Is it infected?"
Isaac asked. The skin around it was discolored, bruised from the violence and push and pull of Sootpoort's long fangs penetrating. But what unsettled Isaac was the color of the wound itself. Rather than the clean pink of a straight cut, he saw shades of blue and green and yellow. He thought of a fish's skin under the light, of scales. "Let the antibacterial in your body do its job," said Sinclair. His thick brow furrowed again, but then his expression returned to one of passive neutrality. Just another bored GP, and he wrapped the wound. After, Sinclair helped him to the door and watched him limp down the steps onto the crosspath. Isaac was halfway across the yard when the doctor called to him from the door. "You'll get him next time, hey, Isaac?" Isaac waved, not looking back as he hurried toward the canteen. The wind was up. They were in for another storm. When Isaac pushed open the canteen door, he caught a backward glance of Sinclair, still watching him through the medhab window. Thanks to Sootpoort, Isaac was early to dinner for a change. He stepped into the noisy canteen and took off his beanie and gloves, before he was urged to close the door behind him by a red-faced technician by the name of Hendrik. Most of the research team were present, all squeezed onto the benches or huddled around small disc tables by the kitchen. Of the 12 members who had arrived with Isaac 3 weeks ago, only Sinclair and Tobias were absent.
"The hunter returns,"
called Oppie from the bench beneath the cupboard. He waved a beer at Isaac in a half-salute.
"Did you get that little fucker yet?"
Isaac shook his head, then raised his bandaged arm.
"Yeah, man."
The engineer poked his neighbor in the ribs with an elbow and pointed at Isaac.
"That little tickalosh you keep feeding nearly killed the cop."
Erin barely looked up from his plate, sparing Isaac the briefest of glances. He pushed Oppie's elbow out of his side and said,
"Blixen, the walking wounded. Shall we give him a medal?"
Him or the cat?" Oppie barked out a laugh, haggard like a warthog in Isaac's ears. "Ignore him," said Nick, appearing by his elbow. "He's been in a mood since Tobias told him he's going up to Cathedralcons tomorrow. Come on, have a seat. Neil tried to make lasagna." "Cathedralcons?" Isaac asked, letting Nick guide him to one of the empty disc tables. It was the highest peak on Marion, and a nightmare of a hike, even when the weather was okay. "It's his turn on the rotation," said Nick. He plucked a plate and 2 bottles of Castle from the kitchen counter and put them down in front of Isaac, taking one of the beers for himself. He motioned at Isaac to sit and took the seat opposite. Isaac glanced at his plate. Neil had tried, and the white sauce and mince didn't look half bad, but the edges of the pasta sheets sticking out from under the layers of Worcester sauce were still hard. Marie would have never allowed such a blasphemy in her kitchen. Isaac tucked in. "Sootpoort?" Nick asked, lifting his own arm with a sympathetic wince. Isaac grunted an affirmation between buttery mouthfuls. "He's getting bolder. How did he manage to sneak up on you?"
"The caves,"
said Isaac. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and took a sip of beer. He wanted to ask about Aku, to confirm that he hadn't hallucinated the whole thing, but shied away from it, afraid to appear too eager. He met Nick's brown eyes over the bottle. He looked like a fisherman in his orange beanie, his beard grown out.
"He's the only one left,"
Isaac said, putting down his beer. What?
Sootpoort. I didn't see another cat all day. Not one.
That can't be right. Nick said the words, but didn't seem at all surprised by Isaac's announcement. Perhaps they've moved inland, somewhere to get away from the storm.
There's no food.
Isaac pushed away his plate and nursed his beer.
All the nests are along the coast.
I'll ask Oppie to keep an eye out tomorrow. I'm sure he'll spot a few on the way up.
I'm telling you, they're gone.
Isaac picked at the beer label, struck by a strange thought. What if Nick and Tobias had gotten rid of all the cats? Without them, his job was done, and he'd be off the island with the return of the ship on its next supply run. He'd be gone, away from Aku. But that was impossible. There were hundreds of cats still on the island. Only, where had they all gone? Got something on your mind? Nick asked. He shared more than just his father's looks, apparently. He was perceptive, too. Isaac shrugged.
Just last night.
Look, Isaac.
Tobias said that Aku was hunting, and I heard her on the roof going after one of the cats.
Nick smiled. You think she's cleared the whole island? In a night?
It's stupid, I know.
Nick sighed, turning his beer between his hands. No, not stupid. Who's to say what is and isn't possible these days? That we're talking about her at all is evidence of the fact that stranger things have happened. Isaac shrugged again. His arm hurt. He wanted to rub at it, but knew that would make it worse. There's only one problem with your theory, Nick continued. He waved at Isaac's bandages. Sootpoort's still at it.
Maybe he got away, said Isaac.
The attack had happened so quickly. Had the cat looked frightened? Maybe. Or was it just hunger and feral rage? Hiding in the caves? Nick took off his beanie and scratched at his crown. His hair was dark and thick, pressed flat against his head by the beanie. That would be a bit of poetic justice after the massacre they've done to our petrels, wouldn't it? Still, I can't help but feel sorry for the old guy. He's practically a part of the island.
Unless he's working with her, said Isaac.
He went quiet for a moment, swilling his beer.
We used to rely on informants to flush out our targets in the townships. Sometimes they'd be tsotzis themselves, looking to get ahead, to wipe out their competition. It wasn't even political for them, just business. And we'd be there waiting for them to come over and sell out their own whenever they were ready.
Nick looked uncomfortable. Whether at the idea or by the brief glimpse into his past, Isaac couldn't tell. It's a cat, he said stiffly. Old, cunning and wise in his way, but just a cat. I hardly think he's conspired with Aku to form some sort of symbiotic predatory relationship.
Couldn't she talk to him like she does to us? It might be clearer to a cat, this feeling, intention, or whatever you call it.
Nick frowned, but Isaac could see the idea was hard to dismiss. I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, he said finally. Let's first see what Oppie finds inland tomorrow. We might be speculating over nothing. Someone switched on the canteen's turntable, and a vinyl record started to play a song Isaac didn't know.
Yeah, sure,
he said over the music. Oppie and his table were singing along. 7 years of bad luck, the good things in your past. Maybe I'll get in touch with some of the islands tomorrow, too, said Nick. See if they're experiencing anything similar with their little travellers.
The others,
said Isaac, remembering what Nick had said when he first met Aku. The French teams on Crozet and Kerguelen, the Brits on South Georgia. Nick counted off on his fingers. The Argentines on Lorry. I suspect the team on Gough have one too, but they're a cautious bunch and haven't done more than hint at it.
And nobody else knows.
Isaac felt like a cop again, piecing together the aftermath of a crisis. Some do. Nick fidgeted with his beanie, folding it over in his hands. He gave Isaac a calculating look, no doubt deciding how much to share, then left his beanie on the table next to his beer. This language stuff. Tobias knows a bit from undergrad, but we've mostly had to learn as we go, and we've had help from outside. Linguists, semioticians, anthropologists, even a few philosophers. None of them know exactly what we have here, but some of them have begun to suspect. Eventually, someone's going to spill the beans. Secrets like this don't keep.
It won't be me.
No, said Nick. And it's like you said, who would believe you anyway? By Nick's expression, the words had landed harder than he had intended. You know what I mean, he said quickly. Isaac finished his beer. He did know. He'd lived his whole life as a passive observer, a bystander, unremarkable but for his ordinariness. Why would anybody listen to him?
You said the others like Aku?
As far as we can tell, said Nick, eager to move on. The team on Crozet described the same phenomena, a language without a vocabulary, the non-translatability issue. The Brits and Argentines confirmed it too.
What do you think she is?
Nick took another sip from his beer and licked his lips. One of the folks on Lorry had a pretty good idea. She thinks Aku and her kin represent a very particular sort of complexity. If language is contingent upon our understanding of the world, then it might be that Aku comes from an advanced species. Her perception of the world, of science and meaning, is far beyond our understanding. But perhaps she can dumb herself down enough to communicate fragments of meaning. We're kind of like dogs to her, I think. Nick had that look on his face again, like Davy wore when he spouted ideology, like the radical youth Isaac used to chase through the townships, like the boy he'd condemned to Flakplas. Still, Nick continued, the fervour in his eyes dwindling to a low simmer. None of that explains how we are able to understand her without being able to translate her language.
It doesn't sound possible.
No, Nick agreed. Tobias thinks it's some sort of oral symbolism, that Aku's sounds trigger parts of our brain architecture, which then responds with the correct association, like verbal hieroglyphs. Maybe it's the frequency, maybe it's something outside of our conceptual scheme entirely. Like dogs, Isaac thought, the idea now firmly wedged in his head. Were they just responding to a sound? Something familiar only on a much higher level?
I thought it was telepathy, Isaac confessed. When you took Aku, I told Tobias I thought it was telepathy. That doesn't seem possible either.
Until it is. Isaac simply nodded at that. Science always seems like magic to the uninitiated, Nick said with a kind smile. And maybe this is. I don't know. There's so much about consciousness and language we just don't understand. Aku might have a complete comprehension of the scaffolding of our brains and be able to manipulate its patterns, the waves of our conscious thought, with simple oral symbols.
Or she might be an angel.
Nick shifted on his seat, looking uncomfortable. That's just a little joke we have about data.
Tobias doesn't seem to like it.
Nick shook his head, then pushed his chair back and pulled on his beanie. He's worried if we say it enough, we'll forget it was a joke to begin with. That Aku will be apotheosized as a result of some sort of mimetic transfer.
Isaac blinked. You mean he's scared you'll start worshipping her?
Something like that.
But you're...
What, scientists? So was Newton, and he believed in the philosopher's stone. Don't think we're immune to belief just because we talk about theory and induction all day. Science works because we believe, not without reason, in certain premises and in the methods used to prove them. But there are many, many brilliant minds that have created complicated theories and ideas, tested within the confines of their understanding, and found them to be, at the very least, plausible. And they were simply wrong. Entire fields of study that are useless, as far from the truth as palm reading. See, there has to be some reason behind the faith. Otherwise, we're just...
Like the Lysenkiists.
Nick smiled again. That's right. Isaac scratched at his arm absent-mindedly, only stopping when he saw Nick's eyes move to his bandage.
When can I see her again?
The question spilled from his mouth unbidden, unprompted by a prior thought, as if detached from the causal mechanism that ordered his brain. He was thinking differently too, he thought. Not better or smarter, just wider. He now saw the parallels between Oppi and Nick's paradigms and the language problem, understood what would have prompted the conversation. I don't think that's a good idea. The music was playing loudly now, but the others had stopped singing along. Isaac looked past Nick, toward the benches and the research members seated on them. They were watching him. Calmly, without malice, with simple curiosity. But they all knew that he knew, that he'd discovered their precious secret, that he'd put their Aku at risk. Nick leaned forward in his seat, regaining Isaac's attention. It's just that the first time was a mistake, right? What's the point repeating it? There's also the fact that I'm the last person you would have shown. Nick's smile was apologetic, even pitying, but he didn't correct him. Isaac dreamed of paradigms, of impossible worlds, of upside-down islands with caves that rested beneath the tide. He saw desultory figures within the passages, huddled for warmth beneath the water, figures of sepia and grey carving shapes into the stone. He saw a cat perched upon the rocks, staring down at the sailors. It was as old as the island, as time itself. Its face was as flat as a shovel. The men spoke to him, but their faces were blurred, and he could not understand what they meant, even though he recognized their words. They gestured to him in greeting, or warning, or fellowship, or fear. Isaac could not tell. His movements were spry, his limbs flush with the energy of his youth. He clambered down the wooden ladder and walked out from the cave. A city of shadows stretched out before him, shaped by abstraction, by thoughts and feeling over steel and concrete. He looked out over the rooftops, the architecture of pain and misery, the slats of indignity, the cracked windows of despair. He saw figures moving between the dwellings. They moved slowly, these soot-stained people. One by one they turned to look back at him. All he could see were their eyes. As he stared, he became aware of a vast presence, another shadow just beyond his view. He felt its warmth pressing in on him, hot and humid, moist with breath, folds of leathery skin. He gasped as it gripped hold of him, yanking him by the arm and pulling at his bandages to dig at his skin. It tore into his arm in a ravenous frenzy, slicing thick chunks from the limb. The figures watching opened their mouths as if to scream, but there was no sound. Isaac tried to turn his head to gaze at his assailant, but all he saw was blackness and the polar sky, and then a 1,000-fold thicket of stars. Isaac awoke in his bed to the sound of his own screaming. His arm burned, and the fingers of his right hand felt wet. He lifted them from out of his blanket and saw the telltale glisten of blood, even in the dark. Then he looked down at his arm. A city moved within his wound. Nightmare architecture, tin spires, rusted frames, ashen figures. The cut was wider now, clawed open by his own damned fingers. It grew as he stared, until it covered the breadth of his entire arm. Isaac cried out again and tried to close the wound, to stop the city spilling out. He squeezed his arm with the same digits that had pried it open. He could hear a sound from inside, like wings, and something else, too. Sirens. Isaac blinked and looked again. The city was gone. The sirens with it. His bandages hung in a tattered mess from his bloody arm. Isaac switched on his bedside lamp and swore. The skin around the bites was covered with new abrasions, marked by his fingers during their frantic Dreamtime excavation. He winced at the line of pus coating the larger of the wounds and peered closer. There was something hidden under the pus, piscine and silver, nearly translucent, hidden in the blood like a second skin. Isaac slowly descended the ladder to his bunk and gathered his things to go wash himself off. In the afterglow of his lamp, he saw Neil watching him from the corner of his bed. His eyes were open wide, like the mouths from his dream. There was something like awe in them. For the second time in as many days, Isaac left the research station before the rest of the team was awake. Even before Oppi, who had a full day's hike ahead of him and the slopes of Katedralkrans to ascend. Isaac headed southwest toward Black Haglet Valley, stopping only to catch his breath or sip water. His arm throbbed at his side, moving between a hot burn and a cold one, like the freeze and thaw of the island. The sharp ache in his knee and the constant itch in his left arm left Isaac walking in a near daze. He was sure a fever had taken hold, but still he wouldn't stop or turn back. I'll walk it off, he thought as he plodded forward. I'll sweat the thing inside of me away. He followed the arterial vein of Tripot River further west, leaving it behind when the grey and brown scarred rock of the Pew Crags appeared ahead, and beyond them the scoria slopes and Sootpoort. Isaac had never had the discipline to ignore an itch once felt, and his arm, and what gauze he'd managed to reapply, was in ruin. He knew he was at risk of infection, and still he scratched at it. At times he felt like a larva, or something in a cocoon, claustrophobic in his own clothes, in his own skin. Even so, he managed to resist the temptation to undress. He knew the cold would kill him. He caught glimpses of the city in his skin, mere flickers of steel girders and tin-topped shanty rooftops, of a forgotten skyline and the dust of unpaved roads. Isaac was changing, evolving into something new. His body was the foundation, his skin the scaffolding, his bones the concrete. He thought of the Christ then. Would he have ascended without his wounds? His crucifixion was his edification, after which only the pure remained. The act was transcendental. Isaac felt a moment of ecstasy, of joy even through the pain, at the prospect of his own transformation. It was a strange thought, one that blew through neural passageways and creases long since abandoned by disuse. The city was around him now. Squat dwellings and shacks growing from the slopes, spires of graffiti-covered stone bursting from outcrops of ashen slag. Black pyroxene crystals became broken glass, and volcanic craters gave way to potholes. Caverns on the slopes of the Black Haglet Valley became doorways that opened into small rooms, tidy and neat, but cramped. Isaac lumbered forward, marching towards his own ascension. The slopes parted a little way ahead, opening onto a plateau ringed by snow-capped peaks. The air tasted like smog, coal, and fumes. Its iciness made Isaac shiver. He nearly slipped on the cold, concrete, gravel-bedded soil, finding purchase on the pavement, lip of lava rock. A siren sounded from some way up ahead, A police lorry on its way into the city, its hold empty, ready to be filled like some hungry belly. The siren sounded again. Isaac looked up. Sootpoort was sitting upon a jagged piece of black tuff, watching him like a sphinx from his perch. "It's you," Isaac growled, a dog to the cat. But it wasn't a cat anymore. Not here. How could a cat survive a place like this? Sootpoort, his tormentor, with black paws stained dark from walking the plains of hell. My gun is gone, Isaac thought dully, as he stumbled toward the tuff, the pillar the demon rested upon. When did I lose it? He drew his hunting knife from its sheath and held it out before him. His arm pulsed at his side, no longer from pain, but in a rhythmic ululation. He was pregnant with something, with his own transformation, a revolt and revolution. "You stay," Isaac barked, waving his knife at the cat. Sootpoort cocked his grey head, moving into a crouch, anticipating the fight to come. A thought gnawed at Isaac as he shuffled forward, barely keeping upright. Revolt against what? Revolution against who? Myself? The order of things? God? He felt movement within his arm, a cold feeler gently pressing at the wound from inside. Isaac fell, landing on his bad knee. He cried out, and the knife slipped from his fingers to clatter on the stone before him. He tried to get up, managing only to get halfway, and then rested on his good knee. He sucked in a breath. He was sweating from the pain and exertion and the fever. His arm pulsed again, and he felt euphoric, revitalized by the promise of renewal. Only now he knew it was a false promise. He had become the harbinger of something foul. He had been tricked. He lifted his wounded arm in front of him and stared into it, past the blue veins and bruised skin, into the pus and scarified hole. The skin gave way to lines of geometry, to the slopes of the island and the ebb and flow of her currents. He saw the outcrops of the western escarpment and the long black ridges above the waves. He saw deeper past the lava flows and into the caves. There, something silver and old shimmered and moved beneath his skin, like a shape behind a window. Isaac picked up his knife. He could feel his heart inside his chest, pounding out a macabre rhythm in time with his thoughts. He unfastened his belt with his thumb and pinky, pulling it off with a flourish and draping it over his left elbow. I won't birth this thing. He waved the knife at Sootpoort, then pointed at his arm with the knife. You want this, huh? The cat twitched a tattered ear and slunk forward, the little nubs of its back moving with the motion. Like wings, Isaac thought. He took the tail of his belt between his teeth and bit down hard. His arm glistened, and Isaac thought he saw tendrils whipping upward from within. He dropped his arm, and then, with Sootpoort watching, he cut it off. Jeez, but you've made a mess of yourself, old man. The voice came to him above the howling wind, and was then accompanied by hard hands. Isaac was pulled to his feet, blinking blearily into the blackening sky. He felt a weight against his side, and then his arm was lifted, and he was moving. You're lucky I found you. Jesus, man, what were you thinking? What have you done to yourself? Isaac stared down at his left arm, at the stump and his make-do tourniquet, and nearly blacked out. A nub of bone stuck out from the skin. Don't look at it, said the voice, pulling him gently. Isaac shook his head, then turned to look at his companion, his saviour instead. Oppie, he managed to garble out.
Who the fuck else?
Oppie gave him a crooked grin through his beard.
Stay with me, Hunter. Just a little way further. One step, then another, all right? Don't talk, just go.
Isaac complied, holding back the moan of pain he felt in his chest with every step. He was barely conscious as they descended from the slopes, but his legs kept moving. He heard Oppie's voice, still talking to him, at him, as they braced against the wind.
Couldn't find your arm. Bloody cat's got it. Nearly there, Hunter.
Why? Why?
Inside, Isaac slurred. In my arm. A bursting.
Oppie didn't pause, didn't falter in his steps.
There's something wicked in all of us, but not that, Hunter. That is a gift. He said the words with reverence. It is a gift.
They kept walking, even as the storm broke above them, and the heavens pelted them with icy rain. The first to spot their return shouted surprised greetings and then hurried toward them in shock. A stretcher was brought out, and Isaac laid upon it, lifted over the winding path between the tin blocks to the medhab unit, out from the rain. Concerned faces crowded over him, asking him questions he couldn't answer, directing them at Oppie when his only replies were slurred and confused. Finally, Sinclair cleared the room, chasing everyone but Oppie and Nick out into the storm. The meteorologist and engineer sat by Isaac's bed and offered him faint reassurances as Sinclair administered to his arm. Isaac waved away the needle Sinclair brandished, but the doctor ignored him.
It's for the pain, he said.
For you both, Oppie added. They held him down as he struggled, but he was weak and old and had lost a lot of blood. The injection filled him with a warm, fuzzy feeling, and he soon slipped into sleep. And for once, it was uninterrupted by dreams. Isaac woke sometime during the night. The room stunk of sweat and blood and disinfectant. Sinclair had left the lights off, leaving only the faint afterglow of the floodlights outside to trickle in under the doorway. Isaac tensed. Something was scratching against the window. Sootport, he thought, come to finish off what he started. But when he looked out, he saw nothing, just the inky black swell of night and the sharp radiance of the floodlights. How do you feel? The voice startled him, and Isaac snapped his head around to stare into the room. Nick was sitting on a stool at the end of his bed, a mere outline in the dark, but Isaac recognized his silhouette. It was the same as his father's. Isaac glanced down at his left side. The stump of his arm was swaddled by bandages, mercifully concealing the bony protrusions he'd seen jutting from the torn skin. Do you need anything? More morphine? Isaac shook his head. He felt like he was floating. That was a near thing, Isaac. If Oppie had taken another path to Cathedralkrans or delayed his departure, he would now be dead. Isaac rasped. His throat was raw. He swallowed and tried again. I needed to. Relax. Nick rose from his seat and moved to stand beside his bed. It'll be a while before you feel yourself again. Isaac grunted at a pressure he felt applied to his stump. He looked up wildly, tensing as Nick squeezed. You're still delirious, Nick said. A syringe appeared in his other hand. All talk of Sootput and demons and the crucifixion. Sleep it off. You both need to rest. Tobias, Isaac wheezed. Nick hesitated, then showed his teeth in a thin smile. He's gone away a while. It's for the best. Why? Hush, Isaac, please. Nick lifted the needle and flicked it gently with a finger. You'll see soon enough. Then you'll understand. I promise." Isaac winced as the cold needle went into his arm, just below the shoulder. He tried to pull away before Nick could inject its contents into his body, but it was no use. "Hush, Isaac," Nick repeated, as his eyes began to close. His last thought was that there was something still inside of him, moving. He hadn't cut enough off. Scurrying feet, little bodies on the roof, meowing and syllogism, but not like last time. This wasn't a hunt, but play. Isaac's eyes snapped open. He lay still, listening to the rumble and thud, the hollow echo of the creatures on the roof. He saw their shadows darting past the window, one sleek and feline, the other a glot of wispy tendrils. He tried moving up onto his elbows, only realizing his mistake when a splintering pain coursed up from the tip of his stump. He swore, and then looked at the shortened appendage. The bandages were bloody, but came off easily, only hurting him when he peeled off the final layer. Then he was staring at the blunted lump of meat that was his arm. Sinclair had done his best, stitching him up and stapling him together like a piece of tattered canvas. But still, he could see past the sutures, into the flesh. It was like looking down a cave mouth. He stared past rock and silt, through the dirt streets and bent tin hovels. Figures moved between the buildings, spectres and shadows in shades of black and midnight blue. And something else. A shape. Albino skin, near translucent, slick with oily wet. It moved across the cave mouth, blocking his view. Tendrils crawled upward from it, toward Isaac through the cave of flesh. It wanted to come out, this thing he carried, that Soetpoort and the others had midwifed. It wanted to come out. Isaac leaned back into his pillows and watched the shadows appear one by one at his door. Nick, then Uppy, then Sinclair, then Neil, his eyes still aglow with fervour or devotion or faith. Then Erin and the others. Their shadows grew longer as they drew their knives.